Hello and welcome to In Conversation at Global Digital Foundation. It feels like freedom to speak our minds is under threat in Europe and in the English-speaking world. To discuss this, I'm joined from Copenhagen by Jacob Mchangama. Jacob is a lawyer, an advocate for free speech, and the founder and director of Justitia, a Copenhagen-based think tank focused on human rights, freedom of speech, and the rule of law. Hi, Jacob.
Hi.
You served as a professor at the University of Copenhagen, specializing in international human rights from about 2005, I think, until 2012. You were the chief legal counsel of CEPOS, the Danish free market classical liberal think tank, from 2018 to 2014. You're also a professionally experienced lawyer, and in 2014, you founded Justitia, the think tank, which is dedicated, I understand, to protecting free speech rights. So you're very much the person for us to talk to in this about this whole question of freedom of speech. So I want to start by pointing out that if our understanding of the threat to freedom of speech is limited to completely justified outrage at the seizing of Roman Protasevich by the Belarusian KGB, then we would be missing out on a big part of the picture, would we not? Because it seems, in fact, that the threat to free speech has become sort of organized, corporatized, or in effect baked in to all kinds of organizations, public and private sector, throughout the Western world. So it's much more complex than a David and Goliath story that perhaps is reminiscent of the past.
Yeah,
what is the nature of the threat?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a global phenomenon. So if you look at whether you use data from the Economist Democracy Index, from VDEM, from Freedom House, from Article 19, I think there's a clear picture that we're experiencing what you might call a free speech recession across the globe, which goes hand in hand with a larger democracy recession. And I think that's crucial to make that connection, because free speech and democracy are intimately connected. And so while obviously in most Western European countries, we don't see as draconian laws and crackdowns on free speech as you would see in Belarus or Saudi Arabia, which Macron is not going to send a death squad to dismember you at a French embassy in Turkey. So it's obviously important to keep perspective, but nonetheless, we do see, in my opinion, a clear erosion of free speech, even in Western democracy, which is ironic because, we live in a time and age where, free speech, or at least speech, is ubiquitous. No one has ever had the same opportunity to access and engage in speech as we do now, but that does not necessarily mean that there are no consequences, or that the relevant institutions tasked with moderating speech, private or public, will tolerate the speech that you engage in.
It seems to be, I think, in the West, it strikes me that it's almost part of this safetiest culture that we have. It's coming out of universities. It's very much a sort of health and safety culture within organizations where one imagines, and maybe I'm imagining, but one imagines legal advisors working for large corporations, for example, or are sort of driving speech codes in the workplace because they sort of fear liabilities in legal action for discrimination and all sorts of things like that, and that the law appears to be sort of like being sort of bent around this a little bit, so that we don't have the straightforward, as you say, police state versus the individual, but we have, in some respects, a much more blanket kind of culture around speech, where the university you attend will have speech codes, and where the company you work for, if it's a large company, will have speech codes, and where what you've done in social media is very heavily exposed to a retroactive judgment, for example. So it's quite pervasive, if it's not as extreme.
Yeah, I think there's a number of different developments going on, all influencing the free speech recession, if you accept that terminology. I think one of them is something that we've seen a few times before in history, which is that the digital age has, in a sense, opened up free speech to the masses in a way that was impossible before. So even though before the World Wide Web was sort of entrenched and became mainstream, there was on paper free and equal speech for everyone, but in practice it was a relatively small elite of journalists, editors, public intellectuals, and politicians who would have privileged access to both to shape and edit the public sphere. Social media has changed that, so everyone in principle has the opportunity, at least, to speak their minds. And whenever you have sort of a radical change where you see a democratization of the public sphere, what I call elite panic sets in. So those who used to shape the public sphere, those who had privileged access to shape free speech, will sometimes with good cause, but very often with with an exaggerated understanding of the danger and using methods that cause a lot of unintended bad consequences, will react and try to limit this. So we saw that with the printing press. We saw that
at every inflection point of technology.
Yeah, and also just like in Britain, even in the 19th century, there was this huge, massive effort by mostly Tory governments to keep the masses from being able to speak their minds, to influence them with radical ideas of political and religious ideas.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a book I read years ago by a guy called Jonathan M. Ward, published by the Pacific Research Institute. I think it was a think tank on the west coast of the US. And he gave this account of all the inflection points in technology, and whether it was the printing press or whether it was radio or television, governments always found a reason why they should control this or license this. And it creates anxiety. Yeah. And
the interesting thing is, there was a time when newspapers were seen as dangerously corrosive.
Sure.
And today, because newspapers, traditional legacy media have enjoyed privileged speech, they now increasingly join the chorus of those who warn against sort of a more egalitarian free speech model. And that is not to say that social media does not, especially with these huge centralized platforms that have developed and grown over the past decades, that does not come with very serious problems and dilemmas. But it's interesting to see how traditional media outlets are increasingly calling on direct and indirect forms of censorship.
Can we talk a bit about history here? Because you have given a pretty good account of the history of, certainly since the war, of hate speech laws in Europe. And I guess a lot of this begins with the aftermath of Nuremberg. And if I can make one observation about the Nuremberg trials, which I think are the kind of prequel in terms of an event to what happened in the UN later on, which you have a lot to say about. It struck me that looking at the attitudes that we had, or that people had, to communications technology and psychology in the early part of the 20th century. So going back as far as the 1920s, for example, people like Edward Bernays, who was the advertising public relations guru. And he wrote a book called Propaganda. And essentially Bernays and various like-minded writers in Germany in the 20s advanced the idea that governments can control the minds of people through propaganda and information. And I know that Joseph Goebbels read Bernays' book Propaganda, and it struck me when reading about the accounts of the Nuremberg trials and reading the judgments and the evidence which are published about the Nuremberg trials, that when it came to dealing with people like Julius Streicher and Otto Dietrich, as you know, Streicher was the editor of Der Stürmer and Dietrich was the Third Reich press chief. But when it came to dealing with those guys, it was kind of assumed that what they said they were doing, which was influencing Germany in its Nazi policy, they were doing successfully. And so it was taken, it was the Nazi claims, or the Nazi propagandists' claims, to actually be able to inculcate Nazism in the minds of the German people were taken at Nuremberg by the judges at the end of the day at face value. And then from there, we then have this idea that propaganda does all these terrible things. And the question in my mind was, is that literally true? I'd like your view on that, because it wasn't a view that I'd read anywhere before, but it was something that I thought about. And then maybe if you can talk a little bit about the aftermath of Nuremberg and into the UN discussion.
Yeah, I think first of all, so I have this podcast called Clear and Present Danger: A History of Free Speech, and I'm also publishing a book called Free Speech: A History from Socrates to Social Media next year. And so, but I sort of do an excavate the history of free speech from all the way from ancient Athens. But so I would say that there are certainly precedents of hate speech, sort of progenitors of hate speech laws that go back further than around the Second World War. You can find it in the 19th century. You can actually ironically find it sort of this idea of group libel. You can see Southern slave owners advancing the idea that abolitionists should not be allowed to publish anti-slavery tracts in the South because they constituted a group libel against white Southerners who were being demonized with good reason, I would say. But you also find it in British colonial era laws, sort of ironically and tragically, there were laws in the Indian criminal code criminalizing sort of statements that would create communal enmity between different classes of citizens, and that law is still on the book. It was by the British. The British used it against Indian nationalists, so people who were arguing for Indian independence and against British colonialism. But the current Indian government, even though it has long since achieved independence, is now using it against its own people for dissent. But so just say that the history of hate speech laws goes back a long way. Then you have the question of Nuremberg, and I think it's a really interesting and it's difficult to say how efficient was Nazi propaganda, but there are some interesting studies which suggest that it was so Nazi propaganda was most efficient when addressed at those who were, for instance, already the most susceptible to anti-Semitism. And also,
young men who were signed up, according to Richard Evans, the historian, young men who were signed up to the Nazi Party were.
And also the generations who had not lived with press freedom during the Weimar Republic. In other words, the generations that were subjected not only to Nazi propaganda in the radio and the media, but who were actively indoctrinated in school, in the Hitler Youth organizations. They remain more anti-Semitic today than other generations. So that suggests that hardcore indoctrination has an effect. But if you read sort of one of the intelligence services of the Nazis reported frequently that various sectors of the German population was privately very dismissive of Nazi propaganda. You saw some of the same things in the Soviet Union, that many people would not openly speak out against Stalin because that would be a sure way of ending up in the gulag or with a bullet in the back of the head. But they didn't sort of internalize Bolshevik or Stalinist values necessarily. So that suggests that propaganda, sort of wholesale brainwashing of a whole people, is very difficult, even in a totalitarian state.
I mean, I know Richard Evans did point out in his trilogy, his history of the Third Reich, that, and I can't cite his sources, but he says in that, he claims in that book that the Germans, on the whole, weren't any more anti-Semitic on the whole in 1945 than they had been in 1933. But what I'm very interested in is this sort of psychological idea that the Nazis had, that they really could change minds with propaganda, which was taken at face value, as it were, by their prosecutors, who said, "Oh, so you said you were doing this, therefore you were doing this," and that the lesson for this after Nuremberg, of course, is that it sort of reifies the whole idea that yes, propaganda is effective and it's really dangerous and you can spread hate. I mean, people like Streicher and Dietrich were actually, Dietrich was found guilty of taking actions which the court said, and I'm quoting, enraged Germans against the Jews. And that's why they found him.
Yeah, but I think it's also like Streicher, he certainly wrote things, especially after the Third Reich was in place, that was openly incitement to, like, that you know, not even the First Amendment would protect that. So I don't think there's any doubt that Streicher openly incited to genocide against the Jews, and that, you know, no matter how much of a free speech absolutist you are, those kind of statements should not be, at least not in my book. So they are sort of just like, you know,
the issue I'm driving at, though. The issue I'm driving at with Jacob isn't obviously defending the rights of Dietrich and Streicher. It's to what extent they were successful in doing what they claimed to be doing, and therefore to what extent the court could make law based on that.
Yeah, sure. And I think, you know, it's difficult when democracies use their standards against totalitarian states, or use the lessons of totalitarian states. Also because, you know, so this German immigrant professor called Karl Löwenstein wrote a famous number of articles on militant democracy in 1937, and where he said, you know, the Weimar Republic had gravely sinned by not sufficiently cracking down on Nazi propaganda, and that he basically said democratic states have to really fight back against fascism and he basically, you know, he argued for a whole plethora of extremely draconian laws limiting free speech and association. But when you look closer at what happened during Weimar Germany, it's clear to me that this was not, you know, this free speech paradise. That there were a number of extraordinary emergency laws, and more of them adopted, which allowed the government administratively to shut down newspapers which it thought engaged in misinformation or threatened public order. And in the last years of the Weimar Republic, these laws were then used even to crack down on liberal and social democratic newspapers, which had initially sort of said we have to compromise free speech in order to crack down. And if you read Ian Kershaw's biography of Hitler, he actually writes somewhere that Hitler ultimately came to see the ban that was imposed on him in the late 20s against speaking out in several German letters as an advantage, a net advantage. It allowed him to sort of cultivate this persona of a martyr, and Goebbels also used this to great effect, creating these posters of Hitler as a martyr.
So you're very good. I've heard you speak before on this question of the UN and I think it was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, my read of all of this period is that these moves in the UN, and you can talk about the role of the Soviet Union and satellites in a second, but my general read of this is that this was held out as a body of international legislation intended to constrain governments from doing what the Nazis had done, which was inciting people to violence and attacking the rights of minorities. But that somewhere along the way, it sort of went from that vision to a point where in the UK, for example, teenagers are getting arrested for tweeting things. So there's a process where it went from this vision of constraining governments to being applied to individuals. And that to me is a sort of there's a watershed point in there. And I think the ICCPR, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, maybe the lens through which that actually happened. But can you talk a bit about that period? I guess up to 1966, I guess, was that period. But this post-war thing and the role of the Soviets and the East Europeans.
Sure. So obviously, shortly after the war, the UN is set up, and this debate about the limits of free speech really starts with during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, and you see there a split between a Western camp led by the U.S. and also the chairperson of the Commission on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, supported to various degrees by Western democracies. But, I think a number of Western democracies, they were not free speech absolutists. The British government and others realized, they recognized a danger of free speech, especially, after the war. They were sympathetic to the idea that you should be able to limit the free speech of enemies of democracy, but they thought the Soviet proposal that there should be an obligation on states to prohibit and punish hate speech as exceedingly dangerous. So you had that clash, and it's interesting to note that the original proposal by Roosevelt and the Commission was basically limiting. Said that free speech, that sort of hate speech should only be punishable if it was inciting to violence, more or less. But the Soviets then came up with this idea that you had an obligation, and that was based on the 1936 Constitution of the Soviet Union, because Article 123 of the Soviet Constitution said that incitement to racial hatred and the like should be punishable as a crime.
So Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and so talks about advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, which is very broad wording, really, into which you can put almost anything that you deem to be, part of that. But it wasn't just the Russians. The French also backed it, I think, didn't they?
The French were sort of they said that they were sort of between the extreme freedom of the American position and the overly restrictive one of the Soviets, because the reason why one of the chief reasons, I think, why the Soviets did not succeed in 1948 is because they basically had this, they wanted to ban fascism, and then they interpreted fascism as including basically all states.
Anyone who opposed them.
Yeah, everyone, you just have to go back and see what happened during the Great Purges, Stalin's Great Purges in the 1930s, to see what that would entail on the ground. But then more independent, more nations became independent during the 50s and 60s. Many of them former African colonies, and I think European states had a very serious PR problem, because they had actually used racist censorship to quell anti-colonial movements, and now they were standing there at the UN saying, well, free speech has to be almost limitless, and you can understand why these African states were saying that we're not going to buy that argument, and why they were sympathetic to the idea that you have to limit racist hate speech that they had.
I don't think India. I think India were, if I'm right in my memory, I think India were also somewhat taking the Soviet satellite line on this, weren't they?
I forget but if you look at the breakdown of votes when Article 20 was adopted in the General Assembly, you will see that the vast majority of sort of old Western democracies voted against, and those who voted in favor were non-Western states, many of them who were not democratic states, and many of them socialist states in the Soviet camp.
There is a very good quote, which to me kind of summed it up, by René Cassin, who was the French delegate at the time. And he said, every freedom has two aspects, that of the protection of the individual against the state, and that of the protection of the freedom itself by the enforcement of the individual's respect for it, which, you know, is an extraordinary statement.
But it's interesting. But René Cassin was, of course, one of the great drafters of the Universal Declaration. But you had the Jewish World Congress in 1953 argued in favor of the idea that hate speech should be there should be an obligation to punish and prohibit hate speech under the ICCPR.
And Cassin was a Zionist, remember, you know, Cassin was a Zionist, and very committed to stopping another Holocaust.
But you know, you can certainly be sympathetic to why, because there's no doubt that, you know, that incitement played a role in the genocide, as you know, incitement does in all genocide. But what is interesting is that in 1952, so the year before the World Jewish Congress advocated this position, Stalin had launched an anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet Union.
The Doctor's Plot.
Yeah, it culminated with the Doctor's Plot, but it was broader than that. So he basically said, you know, all Jews are, you know, American agents. They're sort of cosmopolitans who influence. You know, they
tropes.
Yeah, all the usual anti-Semitic tropes. And so basically, the World Jewish Congress was supporting a proposal championed by the Soviet Union, which was veering into very, very aggressive anti-Semitism. And you know, some historians argue that if Stalin had not died in 1953, you know, Jews might have suffered the fate of many other national minorities in the Soviet Union, in that they would have been deported. Do
you have a theory about the trajectory from mid-century, mid-20th century international law around this, you know, to the present moment? You know, because to me, it kind of comes out of that. It comes out of the UN, and then of course we're into civil rights in the USA, we're into the beginnings of identity politics. To some extent, we do have a philosophical mix in America, I think, with people like the Frankfurt School emigres like Herbert Marcuse, for example, who went to America and who wrote interesting commentaries on American politics. And this sort of blends together, and it sort of brings us to this moment where we are now, where we have a very strongly identitarian, identity politics based sense of rights. Do you have a view on that, or a sense of that frame? How we got there?
I think, you know, there's just a huge difference. You know, the civil rights movement and its allies took a very different course to the sort of militant democratic one. And so you had an outfit like the American Civil Liberties Union, which very early on argued forcefully that in order to protect vulnerable minorities, both sort of those who were hounded by the Red Scare, but also religious minorities and racial minorities in the US, you had to adopt a strictly principled approach of First Amendment freedoms, because if you were unwilling to protect the rights of Nazis, it would basically come back to haunt those minorities whom you wanted. And that lesson, I think, was internalized by the civil rights movement. So John Lewis, the great congressman and civil rights activist, who was once arrested in Dallas for holding up a sign saying "One man, one vote," he said that, you know, without free speech and the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings, or something to that effect. Martin Luther King, less than 24 hours before he was killed, gave his famous speech where he railed against Southern states who systematically denied blacks protesting peacefully against segregation, their First Amendment freedoms. And I would say, to a very large degree, the current free speech exceptionalism of the U.S. in its legal protection of free speech, that was not that is not something that was a given. It was, free speech claims. Free speech claims were routinely rejected by the Supreme Court in the early part of
First World War, I think. In the First World War, I think.
But it was a number of landmark First Amendment decisions from around 1958 and up in the 60s, culminating with New York Times versus Sullivan, that really gave teeth to the First Amendment, building on previous precedents, but nonetheless, this was sort of a culmination. And interestingly, the limits now under American free speech law is basically incitement to imminent lawless action that is likely to result in such action under the
clear and present danger.
The Brandenburg versus Ohio decision from 1969. So this was basically the same court that had upheld the rights of African Americans who had protested the Southern discrimination.
America does have hate crime legislation, doesn't it?
Sure, if you, I'm not an expert in American law, but if you commit a murder and you're motivated by maybe racial hatred or something like that, I believe you can be punished. But that is different from the famous case is the Skokie case, where neo-Nazis won the right to march through a village in Illinois, which was inhabited by a number of Holocaust survivors. So that tells you a bit about how strongly free speech is protected in the US.
So what's what seems to have happened now is that corporations and organizations, including government organizations, have become and I'm thinking in software terms here, a bit like walled gardens, within which there are different rules pertaining. So for example, universities in the United States of America have had a kind of a presumption of guilt on the part of people accused of things, for example. And there appears to be have been an erosion of the idea of a First Amendment on US campuses, for example. Corporations will fire people seemingly regularly for things they have said. So it seems that in the public sphere in America, it's quite robust, and probably in Europe, it's reasonably robust in the public sphere. I mean, obviously there are certain laws which you probably object to, but it seems that we do have a kind of an organizational regime which actually changes the dynamics of this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think ultimately, when you for free speech to truly thrive, free speech is dependent on a civic culture, commitment to a culture of free speech, which again depends on tolerance. And I think John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is primarily about threats from conformity, not threats against free speech from the government. George Orwell wrote much the same. Around the time of the Second World War, he thought that the British government was reasonably tolerant, but he feared, he saw more of a threat by the fact that most newspapers were owned by a number of wealthy men, and that the liberal intelligentsia was not tolerant to ideas that challenged their orthodoxy. And so if you don't, if media and cultural institutions are become increasingly intolerant of divergent ideas, that will have a huge impact on the culture of free speech, on the practice of free speech, which will or risks ultimately having an influence on the legal protection of free speech, because then you become habituated to to a lower degree of respect for free speech that will ultimately maybe be adopted by the legal system. So I think that's a real danger, and that's what we see on social media. I think, you know, social media platforms decades or so, even less, were influenced by these techno-utopian
Sure.
civil libertarian ideals,
Yeah.
but they have sort of quickly come around to the opposite and sort of realizing that, you know, a lot of people are going to put pressure on them not to stand up for the rights of people deemed extreme. And, you know, are you going to fight for the principle free speech of German neo-Nazis, or are you going to be good friends with the German government, on which you depend if you want to do business in Germany?
Or your advertisers, yeah,
and your advertisers, and you know, various groups of minorities who do, you know, and you know, there's no doubt that even you know, I think the available evidence strongly suggests that the amount of hate speech, you know, the share of hate speech and disinformation on social media is actually being vastly exaggerated. But in total numbers, it's obviously a deluge. And obviously, if you are a minority and you're being subjected to vile hate speech, that does come at a significant cost to you.
Is it possible that, I mean, what there is on social media in extremely large quantities is what I would call incivility. And it seems to me that incivility maybe generates, you know, the ad hominem abuse, basically, that this generates an emotional charge, which then sort of carries over into this general feeling of, oh, the internet's full of hate and all the rest of it, and it's hate speech and the rest of it. But actually, people advancing extreme political opinions, I mean, you can advance an extreme political opinion, even an immoral, perhaps, opinion you or I might think is immoral, but you can do it very civilly. now, and it seems that I just wonder, is there a blurring of this distinction which hasn't helped platforms tease out?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think that there's been a what you might call scope creep in the understanding of hate speech. So if you look at the terms of service, the community standards of Facebook and how they define hate speech, it's a very expansive definition, which is significantly more expansive than what follows under the ICCPR Article 20 that we just discussed, for instance. And
I mean, I know in Britain, as you will know, that there is legislation following the Macpherson report into the murder of the teenager Stephen Lawrence, which really more or less said that if you think somebody has racially abused you, then the police must assume that it's happened.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with that report, but it's interesting to me that, you know, I think in 1965 with the Race Relations Act in the UK, which also had an element of banning hate speech or stirring up racial hatred.
Yeah,
I believe the first person who was actually charged was a black person. So you had this group of black nationalists who were being prosecuted, even though these laws were supposed to protect minorities against what I think was real and often virulent racism in the UK that you know, people from the Caribbean and other minority backgrounds face. But
I think the social background. Sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, no, and that's the danger. But I also think, you know, when you see this scope creep, that more and more protected characteristics are protected, then these laws basically become weaponized, and various groups will use them against each other. So if you protect both, you know, membership of a group based on religion and gender identity, for instance, then you will and sexual orientation. Then you will see, and this has actually happened, you will see that religious conservatives face being prosecuted when they say stuff that might be offensive or deemed hateful by the transgender community or the LGBT community. And on the other hand, and this has also happened, the members of the LGBT community might be prosecuted if they say something about members of the religious conservative, and I think that's a real danger.
I mean, to that point, there was, and I wrote about this in a paper on artificial intelligence and its regulation. There are a couple of lawyers who wrote a paper some years ago about how hate crimes are reported in the United States. Now, this is going back to the 90s. And what they said was that there appeared to be this huge upsurge and spike in hate crimes in the US. And this was being reported in the media and was very much driving a legislative response. But where these reports are coming from, they were coming from advocacy organizations who were set up representing groups. And some of the stuff they argued, manifestly would not be a hate crime. It would have been a misunderstanding, or it would have been some kind of interaction, but not necessarily racially motivated, for example.
Yeah, no, and I think that's also one of the problems with the proposed Digital Services Act here in the European Union, that you'll have these trusted flaggers. There'll be a danger that you rely then on NGOs and organizations who have a vested interest in identifying as much as possible, and who might not have a representative view of what constitutes hate speech. So, it's great that we have anti-racist NGOs, but if they use their role as trusted flaggers to perhaps use an inflated interpretation of hate speech, or to further an agenda where to exaggerate hate speech in order to inspire a crackdown on it, or more government action.
Certainly the platforms. The platforms aren't going to die in a ditch over First Amendment rights either. So the platforms, because they're under potential enormous fines from the DSA, for example.
Sure, and that's why you have, that's a huge incentive, obviously, for platforms. Once you have legislations like the NetzDG in Germany, the Network Enforcement Act, which obliges platforms with 2 million users to remove illegal content, manifestly illegal content, even within 24 hours. There's a huge incentive to remove as much as possible. And that, I think, is driving the expansion of categories like hate speech under the terms of service of these platforms, and a huge spike in the number of in the number of pieces of content that is being deleted.
So you think, how big a deal do you think the Digital Services Act is for free speech in Europe?
I think that's a good question. In some ways, it was not as bad as one could have anticipated. So it was not as far-ranging as the Network Enforcement Act, for instance, setting up sort of a 24-hour limit. And I think there are also a number of initiatives that might that we'll have to see what happens. But I think the main worry is this idea, which I think generally tends to be bad for free speech, of centralized control of communication, the free flow of communication and ideas. I think historically, decentralized control over information and ideas has been essential to the spread of free speech. Because
do you mean kind of norms? Do you mean norms? So, for example, if YouTube is found by this new European regulatory system to have committed some breach, that other platforms will just follow suit.
Yeah, that's one indirect pressure, but it's also just, you have then built a huge machinery which does not itself define what the limits are, but can then be used. And this is very dangerous to have in place with this dynamic that I described as elite panic, because then when the next big fright about disinformation or hate speech or terrorist attack comes, then new legislation might be acted, and then you have this model which can then be used to squelch more and more types of speech.
We haven't discussed disinformation up till now. And I think in some ways it is a separate thing, because one of the things I noticed about the DSA is that it doesn't directly deal with disinformation. But what it does talk about is systemic risk. And my read of that, now correct me if I'm wrong, my read of that is that that's aiming at what it thinks is disinformation. So if you spread lots of fake news, you will undermine democracy and so on and so forth. Do you have any, I mean, am I right on that? Is that what, are they aiming at disinformation?
Yeah, I think they now just, because you have this code of practice on disinformation, just like you have the code of conduct on hate speech. And I think I saw a quote just today, so I haven't read it in detail, but basically saying that there has to be more transparency by the platforms or else. So I think the commission sort of operates a lot with these offers that you can't refuse. Sort of let's do this in a voluntary way, and if you don't agree, and if you don't agree, you know, you'll wake up with a severed horse's head in your bed. No, but in the shape of binding legislation.
Yes.
And that specifically deals with disinformation. And again, you know, I think after 2016 and the election of Trump, there was a huge, you know, the whole issue of mis and disinformation became, you know, ubiquitous.
And Brexit,
and Brexit in the UK. And I think, you know, in hindsight, I think a lot of the claims that were made about how disinformation supposedly decided the American election, how it was ubiquitous on social media, have actually turned out not to stand up to scrutiny.
No, not really. I mean, there wasn't really a big Russian conspiracy. There was
well, I mean, there was certainly influence operations, but it just you know, from some of the and you know, this is still research in its fledgling status, and we might, you know, there might be new research might show up, but some research suggests, for instance, that it was a relatively limited amount of Americans who saw sort of Russian disinformation, and those who were most likely to be swayed by it were already just like you know, just like Nazi propaganda was most efficient. You
exactly.
know,
if you were signed up, you were signed up.
So if you were sort of an old, elderly, white, conservative, hardcore Trumpian, you would be confronted with and believe anti-Hillary Clinton.
Well, I mean, there is research which I haven't got access to, but I came across this when I was working in Brussels based in Brussels a few years ago, and it did suggest that whilst more and more people were consuming news from the likes of Facebook and so on, they didn't necessarily believe what they were reading on social media. In other words, even though, you know, you might be getting 80% of your news from Facebook, there was nonetheless a sort of hierarchy in your mind of what should be believed. Yeah. And that hierarchy still actually had traditional media at the top. Sure. So, you know, something fake on Facebook you might see it under a news channel, but your mind would register it as entertainment rather than news. Yeah. And I think this was probably not being taken into account, I suspect. Sure. And in the same way, you know,
Martin Luther, the great reformer, would certainly not have been surprised that, you know, that sensationalized language rather than dry theological language would engage more readers, because that was basically his model for gaining new converts and supporters. And you know, that's human psychology. That's not something that is especially to do with social media. The same way, that's the same reason why tabloids would sell more newspapers with sensationalist headlines than sort of more dry, ordinary newspapers. The same, you have the same mechanism on social media, just at a larger scale. But you know, if you might read something, you know, you might grab a sensationalist magazine that claims, you know, there were aliens, but that does not necessarily mean that you would believe it. You believe it, exactly. Yeah. Or there's this book called Not Born Yesterday by a social scientist called Hugo Mercier, And he sort of argues that human beings are endowed with a cognitive suite of that he calls open vigilance, and that describes what you mentioned before. So even though there's been a huge drop in trust of any information sources, whether traditional media or social media, but as you mentioned, there's still a hierarchy. So significantly more people still believe in traditional media, which have in place or should have in place vetting mechanisms, editors, fact checking, and so on, that social media does not. And so that suggests that people are not as gullible as those who panic the most about disinformation.
All of that notwithstanding, Jacob, I mean, do you think, for example, the ban of Donald Trump after the election from Twitter and the kind of following on, I think other platforms then banned him after that as well. I mean, do you see these platforms, as you said, started off as kind of utopian, utopian ideas, but they have evolved despite themselves into a kind of public square. At least that seems to be the case. So I mean, do you have an opinion about the banning of Donald Trump from the public square? Well, do you think it is a public square? And do you think, how significant is the ban? Is it something we should be worried about in terms of the power of platforms?
Yeah, it's obviously a huge deal, not least because, Donald Trump built so much of his support and sort of his persona on social media and Twitter. I thought it was called for during, sort of immediately during and immediately after the attack on the Capitol, because he clearly was not effectively calling, criticizing or condemning those of his supporters who were attacking the Capitol. So I thought that at that moment there was a clear and present danger to the to the American democracy, which was in session, trying to certify the election, and his supporters attacked it, and he came with sort of very insincere appeals to them. But I think the indefinite suspension of his account was hugely problematic.
I know the European Union was concerned about that because
and Angela Merkel, strangely, given that her government has adopted a much more draconian law to crack down on social media.
Do you have? I mean, we're kind of coming close to the end. Do you have any kind of agenda or ideas for protecting freedom of speech? Are there measures that you think we should be taken? Are there initiatives that should be taken, or is it just a question of going out there and talking about John Stuart Mill and First Amendment? Given how much time I spend on history, I think that's important because free speech is a very difficult and counterintuitive principle for human beings to be able to cope with. It's a great principle. Almost everyone agrees with free speech in the abstract. But once we're confronted with ideas that we loathe or that we deem as being, competing values or trade-offs, our support tends to drop, and it always, our tolerance waxes and wanes according to our own preferences. It's what I call Milton's curse. John Milton wrote this famous tract against pre-publication censorship, but when you read it closely, he basically said, well, censorship is fine, when it's Catholics and atheists and others that he didn't like. So he was basically making an argument that good English Protestants should be allowed to write without prior censorship, which is not a very broad definition of press freedom. And that lives with us today in that, free speech tends to become captured by tribalism. And I think, if we use history, then perhaps we can filter current controversy through that, which makes it less visceral and emotional, and maybe we can see the larger picture. But other than that, I think, it's hugely important, when we talk about hate speech, for instance,
to show the many instances of where minorities and oppressed groups have actually depended on the practice and principle of free speech, and how those who oppressed minorities and other groups have always used systematic censorship and repression as a tool. I think that might have some potential to change the narrative around free speech. We need to be able to show more clearly the very intimate relationship between free speech and democracy, as well as a number of other factors that are crucial for human flourishing. And I think also the idea, that free speech in many ways might be the most, the most important invention ever for human equality. It's the difference between being decapitated for criticizing the ruler, or that ruler being powerless to punish those who argues against him and her, and that really is something really special.
I don't know who it was, but I don't know who it was who said this, but somebody once said that if you don't allow people to believe lies, you will never know what the truth is. It's a kind of Popperian idea of, I guess, falsifiability, that people must be allowed to make false statements because false statements are falsifiable, and therefore there used to be this argument that during the Enlightenment that free speech will necessarily lead to truth. I think that's wrong. But you cannot hope to be able to discover or at least approach truth if you don't have free speech. And lots of ideas that we hold to be true today or held to be true 20 years ago have shown to be much more complicated or flat out wrong subsequently. And if we hadn't allowed people to pose those questions, we wouldn't have discovered our error. And the fact that you have disinformation on social media does not change that. That's great. Well, look, thanks very much for all of that, Jacob. Can you just remind us when your book's coming out?
Yeah, it's slated for February. It'll be released by Basic Books in the US and UK.
And the title will be?
Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media.
I look forward to reading it. I was looking for exactly such a book for a couple of years ago, and it's fantastic to come across you and see that you've actually written it. So I look forward to looking at that. Well, Jacob Mchangama, thank you very much for taking the time to talk about this very important subject with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.